So, welcome. We are halfway through June. Can you believe that? That is just insane to me, but it's awesome. So, in local news, I go back to a Blue Lodge meeting, another Blue Lodge meeting tomorrow night. How cool is that? Unfortunately, it directly conflicts with a Four Bodies meeting. So, darn it, gotta pick and choose. And I am an officer in the lodge, so I kind of got to be there. Then, whoops, got another person waiting. Here we go. And in other announcements, my Wednesday night sessions and my involvement on them is slowly coming down. We're going to, I said last time that we were going to meet and try to figure out what we were going to do. We haven't done that yet. So we'll still continue on a weekly thing until we can figure out what makes sense, how we can work maybe better with the lodges of instruction for the Wednesday nights, or if we need to go to a different night, or 2 times a month, 4 times a year. I mean, who knows? But the point is that we're going to start looking at that and seeing what happens. That was kind of the sad news. The upside is we have several brothers who are looking to bring more presentations in. So maybe that's a different partnership. Maybe that's a different night. Maybe if we have that much more information and education series coming, maybe we do split and start an hour earlier and then have a later evening time slot so that we have 2 sessions per night. That would help out with the West Coast and the West Coast involvement. So there's a lot of really cool options that are still coming at us, and a lot of really neat opportunities for Masonic education ongoing. Refracted light is not going anywhere. In fact, it's growing by leaps and bounds. We just hit 3,500 today. How cool is that? Joe Martinez is absolutely the perfect person to be to have put this into to driven us into this new environment and new way of looking at Masonic education. So thank you. Let's start with a prayer, because all Masonic endeavors should start with the invocation of deity. So please bow your heads or assume a respectful posture. Most holy and glorious Lord God, the great architect of the universe, the giver of all good gifts and graces, in thy name we have assembled, and in thy name we desire to proceed in all our doing. Grant that the sublime principles of Freemasonry should so subdue every discordant passion within us, so harmonize and enrich our hearts with thine own love and goodness, that the gathering at this time may humbly reflect that order and beauty which reign forever before thy throne. Amen. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn this over to Brother Ryan, who's going to talk to us about the Lodge of Instruction and how this all works, and introduce our speaker. And I'm going on mute, which makes everybody happy. Take care. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, Brother Randy. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. This has been a great opportunity to bring some Masonic education to everyone. This is brought to you as a joint effort between the Joint Masonic Education Series as well as the 28th Masonic District Lodge of Instruction. And what that is, for those who aren't familiar, we run a monthly program where all our lodges in the district get together for a monthly meeting that we have presentations and speakers and try to make it educational and basically a good time. And that's what we've been doing with this going online with the COVID situation. And tonight we will be bringing you a presentation called Memento Mori, Why and Where the Skull Belongs to Freemasonry. Our presenter will be Right Worshipful Robert William Marshall, who is a district deputy in Texas, correct?
That is correct.
He's also a deputy director at the Kansas Lodge of Research, and he is a host on the Masonic Light, the Historical Light Masonic Podcast. I encourage you all to go check that out as well. Is there anything else that I may have missed in your title, sir?
Nah.
Okay. With that, I will turn things over to you. I will remind everyone to please keep themselves muted, except for the speaker. And thank you very much.
All right. Well, thanks for inviting me to do this. I'm excited to talk to all you guys, and even doubly excited to see a lot of faces I haven't seen before. So if you're on here and we have not previously interacted, know that I'm excited to do this, especially with you here tonight. I am going to do most of the presentation through the form of a slideshow, so you won't be seeing my face for a while unless something goes wrong. Throughout the presentation, if at any point you have questions, shoot it through the messaging or what have you. I don't know exactly how the format usually works here, but I don't mind being interrupted. So if somebody's in charge of this thing and sees a good question to interrupt me with, then go for it. I have been excited to be a part of Refracted Light and see it growing, and really look forward to seeing where it's going to go from here. It feels like something we haven't done before, even though we're doing all kinds of different Masonic things online now. There's a special uh, tone to the Refracted Light community that I think really holds a lot of promise. All right, so I was asked to talk about the skull, or the human skull symbolism related to the craft and in general, most commonly referred to as being one way or another connected to the Memento Mori tradition. And so that was what we titled the presentation. And I am going to pull up the slideshow. There we go. All right. I don't know, let's see, it's showing me Brother Schwartzberg on here. Could you give me a thumbs up if you can see the title screen of the slideshow? All right, thank you. The skull. Perhaps few images are as simultaneously powerful and mysterious as the cranial framework of the human head. Even the word itself, skull, emerged from unclear origins with a possibly Norse precursor that worked its way into Old English. It is theorized that the word may have co-evolved with a similar early Germanic word that referred to an ice-covered field, and so we find that maybe from the very first uses of the word skull, there was already an inherent subconscious connection between our core identity, death, and coldness. If you look at the Scottish Rite Monitor's explanation for the skull as a symbol today, you find that it refers to both death and sin. Anciently, perhaps no place was more aligned with the psychological inferences of the skull than Golgotha, which was traditionally held to be the place where Jesus was crucified and the location of both the skulls of Adam and the Edenic serpent. The 19th century sensational Masonic Odyssey book, Light from the East, gives a detailed description by the author looking at the hill to the north of Jerusalem and marveling at its resemblance to the profile of a human skull. Trepanning, or trepanation, the practice of cutting a hole into a living person's skull, was a relatively common practice for most of human history.
Just like, hey, good morning, how are you? Like, I miss it, I miss life.
Usually, references to it explain that it was a technique for relieving physical pressures caused by head trauma, but ancient Greek medical documents, like those from Galen or even Hippocrates, also suggest that it was a means by which physicians sought to free mentally or spiritually ill people from possession by evil spirits. Archaeologists have found examples of this technique dating back 7,000 years. And it's hard to imagine how we have been literally cutting tiny windows into the skulls for 70 centuries, and across that time have developed a deep, nearly universal interpretation of the skull with death, evil, and sin. This is precisely why many Masonic leaders today have discouraged or outright condemned the use of the skull as a Masonic symbol visible to the public. In my home jurisdiction, there has been a movement to remove the skull from our Grand Lodge's seal, where it has been at the center since our charter members won the Texas Revolution in the 1830s. Now, currently, the Grand Lodge actually already uses a modified version that doesn't use all of this imagery, but they're wanting to remove the skull even from older implementations of the seal, like in the Grand Lodge building itself. Texas Masonry is not alone in this anti-skull movement. Across the country, there's a growing trend to bathe the symbolism of our craft, so that it appears less macabre to the public. This betrays a potentially disastrous misunderstanding of the symbol itself and of the Masonic journey as a whole. Meanwhile, on the other side of the conversation, we have a growing number of Masons who quite love skull imagery and seem to want to overemphasize it. This too betrays a misunderstanding and could lead just as easily to the same kind of loss of meaning in the Masonic path that erasing the symbol would inevitably yield. What then are we to do? First, we must trace the history of the skull generally and specifically within our craft. Then, we must put that knowledge gained thereby into context for postmodern Freemasonry. And finally, we have to answer the question that all Masons should, but too few Masons ever do. Ask about any one of our emblems. What does it mean now, and what can a person learn from it for tomorrow? I'm going to try to show a video. If somebody already knows that videos don't work, tell me and I'll skip that part. Let's see here. This is available on YouTube.
Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, or vanitas vanitatum omnias vanitas, says the text on the front of this tableau. It's a quote from Ecclesiastes that's instructing the viewer on how to contemplate this image. At first, this work screams death, but in actuality, it's far more complex. It's a contemplation piece on how we reconcile life and death during our lifetime. It may seem counterintuitive, but for many cultures, viewing death as ever present was incentive to live a better life. And we can see that very clearly in this fantastic 18th century vanitas. Vanitas, in its most simple translation from Latin, means vanity, but it's far more complex than that. It means futility, aimlessness, worthlessness, and the emptiness of being obsessed with material objects, because material objects will all eventually fade. To be obsessed with worldly possessions is to be obsessed with emptiness. For example, we can see that here in the flowers. Flowers are typical vanitas iconography. What do flowers do once they bloom? They almost immediately die. Also on the wrist, we have jewelry, and jewelry is also typical vanitas iconography, symbolizing unnecessary adornment and excessive wealth. Essentially, you can't take it with you. But what can you take with you from this earthly realm? Your soul. A vanitas is a reminder not to neglect your spiritual essence, not to neglect your religious practice. There are few Christian symbols more heavily weighted than the apple. It represents the temptation of Eve by the devil and the fall of man, original sin. We can see that here on the side of the vanitas tableau. This is certainly a head that is obsessed with earthly possessions. But on the top of the head, we see a salamander. A salamander is a poisonous lizard, but in early Christian iconography, salamanders symbolized creatures that could be resistant to fire, especially the fires of hell and the fires of passion. So although this head might seem hopeless at first, it is fighting with this idea of resisting the fires of earthly temptation. What's interesting about this vanitas is that it's actually three-dimensional, whereas most vanitas imagery was painted or printed. The three-dimensionality and its life-size nature make the image more visceral and real. You can see that the animals really inhabit this skull. The spider sits atop the empty eye socket, and the little maggots maybe eat the remaining flesh from the skull. The snake curls around the back of the skull, and through the empty eye socket. Nature truly inhabits this skull now. There's no trace of humanity. It may seem morbid, but it's truly a piece of contemplation. What occupies us here on earth will most likely be irrelevant at death. Whether spiritual, religious, or atheist, this work can help us contemplate the fleeting nature of material possessions. How might that impact the way that we live our lives today?
All right, so hopefully that video worked. I couldn't really tell, except it was working on my end. But if it did, you saw how in that particular example of a vanitas, not only do you see the human head becoming the skull, but you also see nature beginning to retake the vessel, as well as some examples of the fleeting nature of vanity, which comes up repeatedly throughout Freemasonry. Without a doubt, probably the most famous instance of a skull being used as a central motif in art is in Act 5, Scene 1 of Shakespeare's Hamlet, when the titular character discovers and recognizes the skull of an old friend. Shakespeare's audience was thoroughly familiar with the vanitas tone of skull and death symbolism we saw in the video. For Masons, the importance of mastering vanity to overcome the threat of death cannot be overstated, and one needs look no further than the death scene in our rituals, where one of our leaders recognized the vanity of trying to overcome death through science or logic, before invoking a higher means by which to achieve a figurative resurrection. Regarding the scene in Hamlet, literary scholars have suggested that Yorick, the name ascribed to the skull of Hamlet's dead friend, might have been a subtle reference by Shakespeare to the town of York. While the York Rite, as we know it, did not yet exist in Shakespeare's time, there may still be a relevant connection. When the York Rite later emerged, it took its name from a tradition popularized by Anderson's constitutions that suggested Freemasonry first formed in York. We now know this is rather unlikely, but one of the oldest existing records of operative Masons, using something called a lodge, referring to both a structure and the community of Masons working on a certain project together, is indeed a 13th century volume of regulations used for the government of Masons building York Minster. It could be that Shakespeare, who died only 50 years before James Anderson was born, had access to the same extant records that led Anderson and the author of the Lansdowne manuscript, which also claimed York as the 13th century birthplace of Freemasonry. Couple this likelihood with the striking echoes of Masonic diction within the work of Shakespeare, or vice versa, and the increasingly convincing argument that Francis Bacon had a direct and significant influence on both the works of the Bard of Avon and on modern Freemasonry, and a picture begins to develop where you can see the very origins of our craft being tied up with skull imagery in the most famous scene of the most famous playwright. Indeed, Hamlet's lamentation for his dead friend and the maturation of his character demonstrated after this confrontation with mortality ties rather neatly with the use of the skull in York Rite ritual and the professed intention thereof. A look at the York Rite's historic use of the skull shows us that a poem that accompanied the symbol in many York Rite circles was first used in that way in the mid-1800s, after an eminent commander read the poem in a newspaper. Tracing the poem back leads us to its publication in 1816, but even then, there are no claims of origin or author, except for the rather obscure annotation of the letter V. We simply know that a copy of it was discovered in the Royal College of Surgeons in London next to a well-preserved skeleton. There is evidence that some of the fellows of that college were also Masons, such as centenarian William Reynolds Salmon. A close listen to the poem leaves one with the impression that it was written by a man intimately familiar with experience as an anatomist and as a Mason. Behold this ruin, 'twas a skull, once of ethereal spirit full. This narrow cell was life's retreat. This space was thought's mysterious seat, What beauteous pictures filled this spot, what drams of pleasure long forgot. Nor love, nor joy, nor hope, nor fear has left one trace of record here. Beneath this moldering canopy once shone the bright and busy eye, but start not at the dismal void. If social love that I employed, if with no lawless fire it gleamed, but through the dew of kindness beamed, that eye shall be forever bright when stars have lost their light. Here in this silent cousin hung the ready, swift, and tuneful tongue. If falsehood's honey it disdained, and where it could not praise was chained, if bold in virtue's cause it spoke, yet never gentle concord broke, that tuneful tongue shall plead for thee when death unveils eternity. Say, did these fingers delve the mine, or with its envied ruby shine? To hew the rock, or wear the gem, can nothing now avail to them? But if the page of truth they sought, or comfort to the mourner brought, these hands a richer meed shall claim than all that waits on wealth or fame. Avails it whether bound or shod, these feet the path of duty trod, if from the bowers of joy they fled to soothe affliction's humble shed, if grandeur's guilty bribe they spurned, and home to virtue's case returned, these feet with angels' wings shall vie, and tread the palace of the sky. The immortality of the soul made sweeter by excellency and virtuous living, and the fleeting nature of wealth, fame, poverty, and pain are all major themes in this poem. Masonic instances of skull imagery, as we've mentioned in the York Rite, but also very clearly prevalent in many versions of third-degree artwork and charts and tracing boards, tend to convey similar messaging. It is also at the core of our funeral ceremonies, when we recall how man springs from dust and must return to it as well. While acacia sprigs, dust, and aprons are commonly used props in our fraternity's funeral services, it is interesting to note that Renaissance-era French funerals sometimes included the use of a skull prop on a coffin, which was given to the widow prior immediately to burial. Anciently, this was tied up in the neat and tidy motto, Memento Mori, Latin for remember that you must die, or some much argued over variation thereof. The Romans certainly took this symbol and the accompanying message seriously. One of the oldest examples of it as an emblem was found in the ruins of Pompeii, which was covered only a generation into the AD era. Here you see a skull as the central weight suspended from a level that balances poverty and wealth. Below the skull is a butterfly that has been interpreted to represent the human soul above a wheel of fortune. Through this lens, I believe, we begin to discern what lies at the powerful core of skull symbolism. To the profane, it appears macabre, and in this day and age, perhaps goth or cultish. How ironic that these words, co-opted by contemporary negative ideas to mean something sinister or creepy, also conjures the memory of Gothic people who are said to have sealed mystery obligations by drinking from a skull as a part of their own initiatic traditions. The Pompeian skull is combined with the human soul as a butterfly, suggesting that this mortal life is a mere cocoon whence our souls may be hoped to be freed through death. As the 1816 Surgeon's poem says, quote, when death unveils eternity. This contradiction tying our finite existence to some kind of infinite promise is really at the heart of the Memento Mori tradition. George Oliver's 1840 work refers to ancient Germanic tribes sealing the obligations of their initiatory rituals by drinking alcohol from a skull. Today, we tend to think of the alcohol being wine, but Oliver suggests that the ancients used mead. The sweetness of alcoholic honey imbibed from an upturned skull as a symbol of the sweet promise of immortality offered man through experiencing and conquering death is, I would argue, by reflecting on the several instances of skull imagery I've laid out here, the central message of skull symbolism. And if you'd like to hear more about the use of honey as a symbol in that context, or even mead itself, hopefully I can share a presentation with you I've done about the history of coffee and honey sometime. Another major figure who can be interestingly tied to the use of Memento Mori traditions, and who has been theorized to have either been a Mason or at least impacted early Freemasonry, is John Bunyan. The author of Pilgrim's Progress also wrote Solomon's Temple Spiritualized, which, in my opinion, ought to be read by as many Masons as possible to develop better understanding for how and why Solomon's Temple became the central edifice in a lot of Masonic ritual. As one of the most read authors of all time, and especially in his time, Bunyan's influence on the modern world is beyond measure. In his book about the spiritualization of Solomon's Temple, he refers to the pillars by name and gives the translations as taught in our ritual. More importantly, as Dorothy Lipson explains in her book about Freemasonry in Connecticut, Bunyan's book produces an interpretation of King Solomon's Temple as a sort of Platonic type to be used for interpreting and comprehending the world around us. It offers up the various components within the temple as figurative models for the various components of life. This ought to sound familiar to any Mason in any tradition. Most importantly for our topic today, and as Arthur Waite artfully laid out in his encyclopedia, this points to the completion of our mortality as a figurative motif to be transcended. This is the key message behind skull imagery, and any doubt about whether John Bunyan, possibly a Mason, but certainly among the most influential people on the founding fathers of modern Masonic ritual, intended to convey that message, can be erased by one look at the ring he left behind in the cell where he was imprisoned for 12 years simply for practicing his faith. This is a drawing of the ring they discovered in his old prison cell. What do we see but a blatant example of Memento Mori skull symbolism? Much later, within the certain bounds of Masonic experience, we find a beautiful exaltation of the Memento Mori lesson, as laid out in Albert Pike's Rituals and Formulas for the same Masonic Templar ceremony in which the use of the aforementioned word, Golgotha, is employed. The initiate is presented with, among other things, a skull, which is promptly raised by the chaplain of the ceremony, exclaiming, "Pilgrim, how striking is this emblem of mortality! Once it was animated like ourselves, but now it has ceased to act or think. Its vital energies are extinct, and all the powers of life have ceased their operations. To such a state, Sir Knights, we are all hastening. Therefore, let us gratefully improve this present opportunity, that when our weak and frail bodies, like this memento, shall become cold and inanimate, our disembodied spirits may soar aloft to the blessed regions of light and life eternal. This exaltation corresponds almost directly with the surgeon's poem from earlier and makes literal reference to the Memento Mori tradition. What does all of this mean for today's Mason? Well, Masons today are as diverse as ever, and their interpretations of skulls vary just as much, too. A great deal of variance exists throughout the world of Masonry, and during my travels to lodges in 50 states and 13 countries, I've seen a lot of different versions. In one country, I was invited to sort of walk through the experience of a Master Mason at their lodge. Imagine my surprise when a light slowly came on in the anteroom and I discovered an actual human skeleton sitting next to me. In this part of the world, it has become the custom for brothers to leave their remains literally to the lodge for its use if needed. But back to America. As I mentioned earlier, there are two large factions vying over the skull symbol within American Masonry. The group that is made uncomfortable by skulls says it looks cultish. It could be that they, many of whom seem to be among the older portion of our fraternity, have not yet come to terms with death itself. despite the pressing need. And their unreadiness confuses them into thinking that no one is ready to deal with this great truth. Mind you, I wouldn't hold it against them if that's the case. I would say their lodge failed them because the third degree obviously is designed to develop that sort of growth. Of course, they might also simply be guarding the fraternity against what they perceive as misinterpretations of the symbol and fear that those misinterpretations will befall our reputation and gain us nefarious labels. But let's be honest. We perform ceremonies aimed at guiding the initiate through an enlightenment marked by confrontation of his own mortality. There is a figurative resurrection. Through the eyes of much of the public, that does qualify us as a strange cult. These older brothers asking to remove skull imagery from our vast array of symbols are overcorrecting, but seeing that they have memories of the ridiculous wave of satanic panic, Ozzy Osbourne biting heads off bats and all that sort of thing, that plagued American culture in the 1970s, who can blame them? No idea what that was. Maybe it was Ozzy tapping in. Our goal with these men should be to bring them around to understanding that that era of witch trial-esque persecution of anything remotely resembling dark arts is over. The young man of America in the 21st century grew up with a boy wizard hero leading the way to manhood. Magic, the occult, and skulls are not as off-putting or dark to the young American as they are to the old. Conversely, the opposite faction, many of whom seem to be among the younger portion of the craft, treat the skull symbol with very little sign of reverence. Not all of them, but there is a tendency. Maybe it's Ozzy's fault again, because for these younger guys, he was just a TV dad who could barely form a coherent sentence. And we were told this was the man the previous generation feared as a version of scary, skullish pop culture. Joking aside, many guys my age are maybe too comfortable with death imagery. Chalk it up to living in a post 9/11 world or whatever you want to chalk it up to, but America has definitely become more comfortable with death. We have removed the bitter from Memento Mori's bittersweet promise and are left with what appears to be sometimes a mocking inheritor, less so of Memento Mori and more so of the Danza Macabre, a 600-year-old tradition that emerged in part from medieval people coping with the threat of the plague and may have been the original impetus for people dressing up on Halloween. In that way, this second faction is no better than the first. Whereas the first wishes to do away with Masonry's Memento Mori entirely, the second overemphasizes it, and the line between veneration and goofy cosplay becomes blurred, which brings us to the final question. Where should the skull be in Masonry today? Well, obviously, it belongs in the third degree and surrounding the death scene reenacted therein. It belongs on any charts or tracing boards connected to that degree. But does it belong on things readily visible to the public eye? And that's really at the heart of the question in the ongoing debate in American Freemasonry. I'd say yes, with the caveat that it should be accompanied by striving for an artistic perfection that is worthy of being in the tradition of history's greatest playwright and Pompey's talented mosaic artisan. Placed carefully among our seals and in the context of other symbols, it can still convey the meaningful message for which it was created. A good test question was posed to me by Daniel Gardner, Grand Secretary of Montana. I think it should be applied by any Mason deciding whether or not to use a skull symbol. Will this skull bring something to the message of my overall image that the level cannot? A great deal of the lesson offered by the Memento Mori skull can be reached through the less controversial level. Since our current society largely still associates the skull with death or evil, we must be careful to display the Masonic skull with attention to whether or not our audience can be reasonably expected to receive it as a celebration of evil or as the triumph over death and evil that it was intended to be. For an example, I will shamelessly plug the logo from the Historical Light Masonic Podcast. Brother Alex Powers put it together to represent our project's aim of diving into the dark depths of Masonic history, so that we can bring forth forgotten truth, with the idea being that that truth could then shed light on the present and enable the future. In it, you see a skull at the center, with a keyhole in the glabella that isn't altogether unlike the trepanation holes used by the ancients to release darkness, physical or spiritual, from the minds of their patients. In our time, the glabella is actually used to identify a patient as dehydrated. When Alex and I came together to work on the Historical Light Project, we agreed that our fraternity, by and large, seems to be dehydrated. Where it once thrived at the oasis of Moses' enlightened tabernacle in the wilderness, it is now aimlessly stumbling around in the dry, dark, and cold desert as we try to navigate generational tension, sharp declines in membership, and a general sort of identity crisis. Our belief is that by poking holes in the skull of our order, we might release some of that tension and use the knowledge gained from the past to enlighten our future. We believe that to be at least one key step to restoring our fraternity. And this version of the Masonic skull reflects that belief. If other uses of the skull can utilize the same type of hopeful and intentional promise in their iterations, the skull can and should reasonably be expected to continue to be safely used as one of the many important and historic emblems of our craft. I'd like to pose one more point for the sake of considering the skull for today's young men, or new Masons, regardless of age. Regardless of how you feel about it, there's no denying that more and more people are no longer identifying with any particular religious tradition. Instead, we're increasingly a religiously ambiguous people. For much of Masonry's history, the church offered people the promise of triumph over death. You can look to Mexico's Dia de los Muertos tradition for a clear example. But if the church continues to be less and less likely to be the source of that promise, why shouldn't Freemasonry step into that role? We frequently invoke the idea of the immortality of the soul and the triumph of good over evil. Our apparently unique ability to do that without necessarily adhering to any one religion exclusively ought to be one of our greatest strengths in the postmodern world. And if utilized, it could serve as a powerful magnet to attract young men to the craft. That's my skull talk.
Oh, very cool. Okay, let's see. We do have a couple of comments. We had a lot of comments on Memento Mori and the connection to Pompeii. We've been talking about Pompeii for quite a bit. And Brother Joe, you had a very interesting comment here just a moment ago. Do you want to talk about that for a moment?
Sure. Yeah. And sorry, I typed it in. I was doing two meetings simultaneously. Fantastic job, Brother Robert. I love hearing you speak as always. So I wasn't saying you, Randy. I was saying Robert. No, all I said in the chat was I really found what you said interesting about using the level as a substitute for the skull. And I know we're speaking publicly, so I have to frame my words carefully. But if we're going to apply both of those symbols to the concept of the concepts that they entail, I think the level really speaks more to the flow of time and, the level being used to view everyone on those same stages of life, of youth, manhood, and old age, and our passage from youth to old age. And that we just should be reminded that we're all traveling on that same road. But I think the skull doesn't really, for me, speak to a journey. It speaks to a destination. So that place where we all end up is more symbolic of the skull. It doesn't really care about the journey, so to speak. It's more of the destination. And to your point at the end, no matter what beliefs someone has, it really is our earthly destination, regardless of what your beliefs are, who you pray to, or who you kneel before. So that was my take on it.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks. The question posed about whether or not you can use the level when you feel inclined to use the skull was an interesting one to me when it was cast my way, and I think there's a lot to work on between the two. I hadn't considered uh, uh, looking at it the way you just did, which is interesting. Uh, the uh, the argument made by Gardner, of course, being that uh, the skull meaning we're all gonna be there, and the level being used at least exoterically to demonstrate the same sort of doesn't matter how rich or poor you are, that part of the tradition at least is very much in the same vein. But I agree with you. They're definitely not this.
First, wow.
Agreeing with each other seems to be a rarity, right? No, it's all good. The other questions or comments that came up really was more about the mosaic that you had posted up, the tiled artwork that was found in Pompeii.
Okay.
And it was just some commentary off to the side. Did you have anything more that you would like to talk to that? Okay.
I don't. I know that particular image has been almost beaten to death, so to speak. But I've found that usually within our context, it seems to come with an assertion that came out of a lodge or some kind of early Masonic group, and I feel like that's a pretty big assumption. Uh, but
So I can actually add just a touch to that. That was found on a table in the middle of a room in Pompeii in the house Diogenes Sin, which is House of the Builder, or Builder's House. The next piece to that is it was a Roman collegium. For us to say that we are directly connected to the Roman collegiums is way too much of a leap. It's interesting that they use much of the same symbology in the same kind of tracing board type feel that we would, but yeah, to say that there's a direct connection is probably a bit loose. The symbology though is awesome. I was very happy to see that you had included that. So
yeah, no, yeah, you said it plainly there. I always worry about hurting somebody's feelings, but yeah, I'm right there with you. It's pretty crazy to try to assert that there's a direct inheritance between the two, because heaven knows historic record is lacking if that is the case. But I think a lot of times we get caught up, especially if we're looking at Masonic history, in trying to prove that A informed Z, and we do it often, or we're driven to do it often because we do see some kind of common connection in the symbology or something along those lines. And I think it's sad because either the response is usually, yeah, that must mean that's exactly where we came from. There must be a direct lineage, or that's bogus and there's nothing to that, and we shouldn't even be looking at it. When the obvious middle ground, at least to me, is that, well, we claim that these symbols we use are inherently indicative of the meanings we apply to them or interpret out of them. And we claim something about pursuing universal truths in Freemasonry and in other traditions like it. So it could simultaneously be that we're not directly descended from any particular ancient tradition, and we have landed on the exact same truth. And that does still strengthen the validity of our tradition, in my opinion.
oh yeah, absolutely. The another comment from Brother Matt Stewart here, whether there's a direct connection or not. Whoops, I just lost it. Where there's a direct connection or not, it seems our fraternity has taken bits and pieces from various philosophies across time and the globe, right? And oh my gosh, well, read Morals and Dogma, and read Esoterica as the first two. Brother Robert, what do you think?
Absolutely. Those are great options. Of course, depending on your copy of Esoterica, on the back, you're going to have a skull with an Ouroboros around it. But Arthur Waite and a few others that I mentioned in the presentation. But there's a lot of work out there on the tradition of skull symbology. There's not as much as I'd like to see on it in Masonic texts, right? We're talking about Pike and Waite over 100 years ago. It's a pretty taboo subject. I do believe that Masonry suffered a great deal as a result of the satanic panic of the 70s, 60s and 70s. And we, both internally and externally, in the way I talked about in the presentation about how some of our leaders, well-meaning leaders, suppress certain aspects of our tradition out of fear of what it might look like, and also genuine external anti-Masonic sentiments making those exact accusations. And I think because of that, there's been a great lack of attention given to this, among other aspects of the fraternity for a good 40, 50 years now.
Brother David Hill, well, first off says hello, and second on the chat, on the live stream, has said our traditions are informed by the ancient traditions. Doesn't matter if we're direct inheritors of the ancient mystery schools. Masonry is a modern manifestation of the Western mystery tradition either way. Now, I'm sure that's going to evoke some commentary both directions, whether you say there is or is not such a thing as Western mystery, but okay. I think that's very amusing. Both arguments are really funny to me. And that's not to try to get anybody upset at me. There's plenty of people upset at me. That's just to say I think it's amusing. Then Brother Kyle Sledge says, right, Worshipful, I love your point about the focus on immortality of the soul without respect to a particular religion as a key point that distinguishes us. Thank you for that piece. It will be shared soon and in good company. And let's see. I think that's pretty much it, unless we want to go into some of the Shakespeare commentary. Up to you guys.
Commentary.
Yeah. Okay. So from Brother Mark Moran. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, Brother Mark. I'm sorry. In Henry VI, Part 2, the death of the third degree teaches all brethren to face with equanimity. Sorry, is touchingly embraced by Peter. Here, Robin, and if I die, I will give thee my apron, and will thou shalt have my hammer. And here, Tom, take all the money I have. Having won through the prevailed in the right, the king declares that God is justice, hath revealed the truth and innocence of this poor fellow. And Peter gives the invitation, come, fellow, follow us for thy reward. All right. So we're picking on Shakespeare a little bit. We're picking on the Bible a little bit. We're picking on some Freemasonry work a little bit.
You can also pick on Poe.
Absolutely.
Mask of the Red Death comes to mind.
Mask of the Red Death.
That's sort of the most blatant one. The Road to El Dorado is another one. I'm just throwing things out in here to talk about.
Cool. The, so with that in mind, are there some other pieces that that might be tied together here? That's a really interesting question. I don't know that there are or are not. Brother Robert has left his chair. We've run him off. Oh my gosh! No, how did I know you were going to your library?
I'd recommend this book regarding Shakespeare. This does a deep dive. It touches on the like I said in the presentation, increasingly popular theory that Francis Bacon influenced Shakespeare. I think is fair. There's a great number of people who believe they were one and the same. I haven't reached that level of certainty yet, but there's definitely a conversation there. It looks like Brother Joe's got one too. I don't know. All I saw was William Shakespeare. So
yeah, we got unabridged William Shakespeare.
Oh, nice.
85 cents at the used bookstore. How depressing is that?
Nice.
Yep. If you want to make people stop appreciating something, force them to indulge it while they're young. And
yeah.
Don't get me started on that, man. Don't get me started on that. Brother Robert, have you also heard about the whole Marlowe theory, right?
Right. Yeah.
So that's the other sort of big theory. And if you look at Marlowe's great work, right, like the death imagery in there, I think it's pretty evident. Like with the whole. What was the most recent? I think, doesn't Pike's work also reference like what Mephistopheles actually looked like, or what he was described to actually look like, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, I'm not sure on the Mephistopheles reference. But yeah, Marlowe is definitely another one of those theories. I think there's enough evidence. We know Shakespeare existed. The question is, how much of his great works came solely from him? How much of it was influenced by external factors? That's to me what the academic question becomes. And there is plenty of evidence that both of those luminaries from the time would have influenced it. But somebody quoted some Shakespeare. There's other parts in Shakespeare where you get full phrases that more than just echo Masonic diction. And as I said in the presentation, or vice versa, right? So because of the time at which he was living and producing work, we're not really that clear about what constituted Masonic ritual at that time, but we do know it existed. And it was a thing growing in influence as we shifted from the Renaissance to Enlightenment. And I picked three major figures in the presentation on purpose. Shakespeare's life ended right before the birth of John Bunyan, and John Bunyan's life overlapped with James Anderson. And I think a lot of us, myself included, are prone to thinking of these guys in kind of like exclusive bubbles, and especially to think of James Anderson, for example, being only a generation and a half separated from William Shakespeare. You can really start to kind of reshape the things that influenced the Masonic ritual as it emerged. We tend to think of it just being right then, right there, and that's just not how humans work.
Oh, very cool.
Robert, do you think that some of that might just have to do with Preston and the fact that he worked in a print shop and had access to a lot of these things?
Absolutely, and not just Preston, but all those guys, right? All of our known early Masonic leaders and influencers on the work tended to be, compared to today's time, very well educated in the context of literature, the 7 liberal arts and sciences, if you will. So yeah, there was going to inevitably be some amount of that. What I think starts to or must be questioned when you get far enough back to Shakespeare's lifetime is at least our examples of the Masonic ritual in the decades after his life are relatively crude and undeveloped, and maybe that's inaccurate, or maybe the later development came from Shakespeare, or maybe Shakespeare was uh, sharing something from an earlier tradition or version of Masonry that we really just don't have a record of. I don't know, but without a doubt, I think we do tend to forget how not just Preston but all of those guys were very well versed in this stuff. And so you look at what we have for speeches from the 1730s, 1740s, and what have you, and you see very clear references to uh, literary works that would have been common among learned men at that time that we have completely forgotten about 300 years later. And so we've got blind spots that stop us from being able to understand it until we identify them.
Cool.
That's and within the presentation. That's one thing I tried to do with the poem I read from the Royal College of Surgeons. So that poem, as I mentioned, has been used in York Rite circles for 150 years or so. But if you find examples in Masonic literature of attempts to identify its source, the very best you'll find is that it was in a London newspaper, or that the London newspaper got it from the Royal College of Surgeons. But there's no inference that it originally had Masonic intention. And if you go back and listen to that thing, it's got Masonic imagery all over it. There's no way the person who produced that did not intend to inspire both his anatomist buddies as well as his Mason buddies. And that's the kind of blind spot I think is stopping us from learning more about where our rituals or ideas emerged from.
Wow. Wow. Interesting. That's pretty powerful what you just said, because anytime you say the word blind spot and then can back it up like that, that makes me stop and think. Brother Jake, I see you on here, and you've done quite a bit of historical research into this. Did you have anything that you'd like to ask or add?
Not really, Randy. I think we've had some great discussion. I think skulls are super awesome and have fantastically deep meaning, and we don't have enough of them. We really don't. They're one of those really unique symbols that I think provide us with profound reflection in a multitude of ways, and just doesn't get the attention, I don't think, depending on the jurisdiction, as much as rightly is due. But yeah, great presentation tonight. Enjoyed it a lot. Thank you.
Very cool. Passing it around, is there anybody else that would like to bring something up or discuss any of the points or talk to Brother Robert?
I'd just like to say, going back to the symbology of the skull, and I find it interesting that Masons tend to be people who get great things done. A great example that comes to my head is Admiral Byrd, who discovered the South Pole. And when I reflect upon the skull and think about it's not a dark symbol like you started your presentation with, but more a symbol of that eternity. And I think that a lot of Masons who contemplate on that do get inspired and get inspired to do great things. The concept of your life and trying to make it have some meaning, to not just be waste, I find inspiring. And that is what I get out of some of that symbology that we went over tonight, as opposed to something macabre or devilish. But I've always found it interesting that, Masons seem to be empowered by that feeling of not being afraid of death.
From the live stream chat, there was a question: is the skull still used in other rituals? There was a follow-up from Joe asking if that was Masonic rituals or other traditions. There wasn't a reply to that, but do you want to talk about some of the both Masonic and non-Masonic rituals and traditions by chance? Up to you how far you want to take that.
I feel like I would be very limited in how much I could talk about that, but I can tell you that Masonically, it is still used to varying degrees in jurisdictions across the world. I mentioned the country I went to where they have a real human skeleton sitting next to you in the anteroom, and I say that as somebody who worked on a history of anatomy book and have looked at more than a few dead human bodies. I'm not easily fooled into thinking a fake one is the real McCoy. It was a human sitting there. And that's a pretty powerful thing if it's done right. And I definitely got the sense going through a mock degree with these guys that they do it right. Although I don't know that that's necessary, it's pretty powerful. And there are certainly lots of model skulls or skeletons used in Masonry, most prominently in America, in the York Rite, of course. I guess I will also say I know for sure there are lodges in America that are making use of skulls under the radar. Because their jurisdictional leadership has forbade it at all. And it is being done. Good luck policing that. They're Masons. In other rituals, that's an interesting question. Of course, in early Christianity, crucifixes were commonly shown with a skull on them. And in Catholicism, which I referred to, that is still not uncommon. I'm feeling like I'm remembering something from the recent book on Freemasonry and the visual arts. I wish I had it here, but I think I left it at home today. Talking about Haitian voodoo making use of skulls. That book has a whole essay just on Masonic imagery within Haitian voodoo culture, which was pretty fascinating. And I don't know, I think to answer that question, you'd have to start really getting into what you do, what you consider ritual and stuff. How much of a subculture has to be occult or esoteric for it to be considered ritual. And you can get into certain genres of music and things like that make profound use of death imagery. So I don't know. It's definitely still in use, though, to answer the question succinctly.
Very cool. Thank you. That wraps up the questions. And before I make in a couple of more announcements, Robert, I'll hand it back to you for any closing statements you might like to do. Very, very well received. We had almost 50 people between the or just under 50 people between the live stream and the participants on here. So it looks like a pretty successful, a very successful broadcast here.
Well, I hope they enjoyed it. And as far as closing statements, they're probably all tired of hearing me ramble. So that's my closing statement.
That was an awesome presentation. Thank you, folks. I've got a couple. I'd like to turn it back over to Ryan and to Joe Martinez to talk about LOI and Mid-Atlantic Esotericon. Mine is Happy Hour. I host a loosely Masonic happy hour, 4:30 Central Time, 5:30 Eastern Time. If you do not have an invitation to that and you would like one, please reach out to me privately. Happy to have you on. That's on Fridays. That's a Friday, every Friday from 5:30 Eastern. It's drop in, drop out. It's casual. If you don't have to be there right at whatever time, or if you need to leave early, do it. But it's a nice way to wind down the week, and you are certainly welcome. Tomorrow, for Scottish Rite folks, Brother Jake is presenting on the 16th degree, I believe. Brother Jake, are you broadcasting that, or is that in person only tomorrow?
That is going to be to any brother who registered, so it'll be live to Zoom.
Okay, live.
Not broadcast out though. No.
Okay, it's live to Zoom. It is Scottish Rite. It is pre-registration only. Again, if you need to reach out to Brother Jake, if you don't have his contact information, ping me. I will get it to you. Then Brother Ryan and Brother Joe.
Thank you, Robert Marshall, for this presentation tonight. It was excellent. Absolutely excellent. It was very interesting. I like these kind of topics. They're a little off what we're normally doing, and I think they're very interesting. My job is to make these presentations interesting for my district and to try to draw people in and educate them on things that they may not be exposed to in their lodge. So this was awesome, and I do want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much. And also thank you to everyone who helps out behind the scenes here. There's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes, Brother Randy and Brother Joe and like the Jarzavec. I mean, it's a group effort, but this has been really, really fun to be able to do these meetings and connect with people all the way across the country and bring them Masonic education. So I'd like to say thank you. Normally this would be our last Lodge of Instruction for the year, and we would end it with a big cookout, but that's not going to happen this year. They are talking about maybe, having lodges not go dark for the summer. So I don't know. We'll see if we continue these throughout the summer. Maybe we'll do once a month presentations still. I don't know. We'll see. More to come. But thank you, everybody. And thank you, brother.
Thanks, Brother Randy, for putting me on the spot. I didn't know I was speaking. Yeah, thanks to everyone who is a part of Refracted Light. I mean, like Randy said, it was a place to bring light to those who couldn't find it, especially with the the quarantine and all that stuff. And we're definitely sticking around. Brother Robert, thank you so much. That was phenomenal. All your presentations are phenomenal. You are currently my favorite Texan. And that's a very short list. So congratulations. Randy, you wanted me to talk about Esotericon. So really briefly, I'll just talk. A lot of you guys know already. Esotericon this year is virtual. I'll post more stuff on the Refracted Light page, but we're going to have Chuck Dunning, Don McAndrews, Joe Wages, also a Texan, Brother Dave Bacon, Brother Angel Millar, and Brother Robert Johnson. It's going to be a full day of virtual education. We're going to go with a webinar format, but we are selling tickets. 75% of that is going to charity. We decided not to cancel this year and move to virtual. So if you want more info, I'll put it on Refracted Light. And then Randy, you missed, and Randy's wearing the sexy shirt and is pointing to it. So there you go. Comes in all sizes. And last thing I'll say is, Randy, I don't know if you want to mention, a couple of guests on the Facebook stream mentioned something about not getting an invite, things like that. So all I'll say about that is, you know, to the Zoom, all these presentations are brought by different people. You know, Brother Ryan and Brother Mike and Brother Randy, they have their own thing. North Carolina does their own thing. And then we have some people doing ad hoc stuff. So everybody sets up their invitations differently. Some are completely open and posted out on the internet. Some require registration, and then some are email invitation. So I can't speak to how Brother Randy does it, or how Brother Matt does it, or how I do it. But it's different for everyone. There's no leadership in this group that decides how we put out Zoom meetings. So like I said, it's different for each one, but just make sure you check the events and it'll tell you how to connect. And if you don't, or you can't, they're always on Facebook Live as often as possible. So, but yeah, I didn't want to speak for you, Randy, but I saw that, so I figured I'd bring it up.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely true. We all do it a little bit differently. Look at the events page. The events page is going to have everything on there. Some of it may be a little bit last minute, especially for me. Sorry about that. It is what it is. Some of the things are going to be pushed out a little bit earlier, and you should be able to see that kind of heads up. Again, if you want to be a part of the Zoom crew, send me email. That's probably the best, fastest, easiest way to do it. Yeah, thanks. Mid-Atlantic Esotericon, unbelievable. I got to tell you, last year was unfreaking believable. Do it if you have any options or any ability to do so. It's worth it. So I've got a note that says, sorry, we're having trouble playing this video. It probably clued into my, is that the Boynton Research Lodge? I want one of those shirts, Scott. It probably clued into my the symbol and was wondering if it was copywritten. So, all right, folks, that's all I got. Thank you, Brother Robert. I'm looking at maybe putting something together with you, me, RJ, and a couple others that have actually done home brewing and understand beer. And how cool would that be to have a fun Masonic beer panel? I think the brewing and honey, the coffee and honey would go well with brewing and alchemy.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on that with coffee and honey that we do. But I've brewed beer before, and just last weekend, my fiance and I had our first successful batch of kvass.
Wow,
that was pretty cool. Yeah,
very cool.
Say it slowly now, kids. The Masonic Brew Crew.
I think we're onto something here. Alchemy
I can
RS.
see the t-shirts now. I can see the t-shirts now.
Applied Alchemy.
I could weigh in on winemaking. I haven't experimented with beer, but I could weigh in on wine.
Randy, you could make an IPA really heavy with hops, very, very bitter, and call it the Master Mason. I mean, the Past Master.
The Grumpy Past Master. The Grumpy Past Master.
Absolutely.
The Grumpy Past Master.
Absolutely.
We can do it with some moldy cheese.
Oh, you know
maybe a lot of salt. I don't know. Maybe some salted pork.
Hints of green beans.
Oh!
Oh, you're going to make me run across the store. You're going to make me run across the store. You're going to make me run across the store.
Oh,
we got him fresh right there. All right.
There we go.
Anyway.
Parth just had to show that to Matt. It's one of his things that he must do.
if I'm working at something I must do, it is a requirement. Right.
So, folks, I'm going to stop the live chat here. Folks on Facebook, thank you for joining us. Have a great evening.
Yeah, put nothing in Romania. Sorry.